It feels like making a 6-hour movie. It feels like telling a complete story. It's a beautiful experience to have. It is not for people who love sleep. It was, 4 months of non-stop every day. And there's a lot to track, and especially the way that we shot that show. We did all the exteriors in Montana and the interiors on a stage in Texas. So someone would have a big emotional moment outside and walk into the cabin and you'd be like, hold that, we'll come back to that 2 months from now in a different state on a stage. So there was a lot to track throughout the process, but the sense of fullness and wholeness that comes out of being able to tell a story like that beginning to end is really remarkable.
Hi everyone, and welcome to How She Does It, where we meet extremely talented women who are thriving in their careers, and we ask them how they do it. I'm Karen Feinerman. I'm a longtime Wall Street investor, a mom of 4, and a panelist on CNBC's Fast Money. One of the most successful forces in the entertainment industry in the past decade has been Taylor Sheridan, and a major player in his inner circle across shows like Yellowstone, 1883, and now the Madison, is Christina Alexandra Voros. Voros, who has been nominated for an Emmy, moved up from camera operator to director of photography to director and now an executive producer for Sheridan. She got her start first graduating from NYU Film School and then working behind the camera for Hollywood heavyweights including Ava DuVernay, James Franco, Tate Taylor, and David E. Kelley. Her credits include projects starring acclaimed actors like Octavia Spencer, Samuel L. Jackson, and Sam Elliott. She joined Yellowstone in season 1, working her way up to cinematographer for nearly half of the series, as well as directing 12 episodes, including a good portion of the hit show's final season. Christina joined me in studio, and we talked about why her latest project, The Madison, starring Michelle Pfeiffer and Kurt Russell, is different than anything she's taken on before. What it's like leading a large crew, cast, and often animals through shoots in the sweeping landscapes of Montana and beyond, and how she met her husband, a true cowboy who convinced her to move from Brooklyn to a ranch in Texas. This was a fun one. Hope you enjoy. Christina, thank you so much for being here. What a treat to have you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so we got a lot to cover, so I'll just jump right in. Almost a decade ago, you penned an essay about seeing Wonder Woman with your stepson, directed by Patty Jenkins. In thinking about the glass ceiling, you wrote, I realized the journey I was on could lead to a place with a view I could have never imagined, a view I had never asked to see. Tell us about that feeling of seeing that movie.
It's funny. I brought my stepson to see that movie, and part of it was a lesson plan as a parent to explain to him that this was really the first time a woman had directed a superhero movie of that size with that sort of budget. And we walked out of the movie theater, and he looked at me and goes, I'm not sure I understand what the big deal is. You're a director, and you direct movies. She's just another female director. And I thought to myself, that's great. It's great that you had the frame of reference to understand that there are women in this space doing this. It's great that you aren't surprised or you don't think it's unique, because that's how it should be, right? It should be equitable that way. My career has been this very unusual, serendipitous trail of doors opening when I least expected it to. And even now, I kind of look back over my shoulder and I'm surprised by how far I've traveled to get here.
Okay, let's talk about the sort of serendipitous part. So you joined Yellowstone in its first season as a B camera operator. So what drew you in, or were you just happy to have a job?
Both. Yellowstone was brought to my attention by a friend of mine who was a first AD who was interviewing for a position on the show, and she had seen the pilot, and she called me because my husband is an animal wrangler, and she called me to say, I just interviewed for the show, there are Mustangs and cowboys, and does Jason know about it, and he should try to get on it as a wrangler. And I looked it up, and I realized it was Taylor Sheridan. I was already a fan of his work as a screenwriter, and his cinematographer of that first season was a colleague of mine from New York. We had mutual friends. We'd worked in the same spaces. And so I reached reached out to Ben Richardson, who I hadn't spoken to in years, and said, I know you may think of me as a DP and not an operator, but I would be so interested in coming to work in this world. Would you consider hiring me as a camera operator? And I'd never been an operator for anyone other than myself. I came up in the indie film space. I shot a lot of movies for James Franco, and I was always operating a camera for myself. So I'd never done it for another cinematographer. I wish I'd had my first season of Yellowstone. I thought, this is amazing. You get to show up to work every day, make beautiful pictures, have nothing to take home with you stress-wise, and show up on set the next day and do it again. Ben reached out to me several weeks later and offered me a position on B Camera as an operator on that show. And I spent the first 2 weeks convinced I was going to get fired because I didn't understand the politics. I didn't understand the scope of something that large. I'd been working in much smaller indie spaces and never anticipated that year where things would go. I remember calling a mentor of mine from film school, Carol Deisinger, in the middle of that show, weeping, going, was this a step backwards? I was a cinematographer and now I'm an operator, and I'm not part of the creative voice of the show. I'm just executing things, and was this the right choice? And I remember that moment so clearly, and I am so grateful that I stayed the course.
So tell us what a B camera operator is versus a DP, director of photography.
So a cinematographer is in charge of all the cameras on the show. Every camera has its own operator. A camera is considered by many to be the most important camera. It has the most designed shots. It is usually the most experienced operator. And B camera is secondary to that. C camera is secondary to that. As a DP, I have a much looser interpretation of the alphabet when it comes to working with my camera operators. I see them all as sort of different paintbrushes in my paint box, and all of them equally important. But B camera is fun because you're not necessarily tasked with getting the big dolly shot master. You may be put on a longer lens to tag a handoff from one face to another. And there's a lot of, if you're working with a cinematographer who leans into that jazz, there's a lot of freedom in that. And so I think it was my work on B camera that caught Taylor's eye and made him think of me as a possible contender to take over as a DP on the show the next year.
So you were promoted and
Yes.
then promoted again to director.
Yes.
How did that come about?
I took over as a cinematographer on season 2. On season 3, I was offered a block of episodes to direct. On season 4, Taylor said, well, you're a cinematographer and you're a director. Do you just want to shoot your own work as a DP? Which, I remember being in film school in one of my first cinematography classes asking a professor if you could do both, because the idea of doing both seemed really cool to me. And he said, maybe in advertising, but you're not really going to get the opportunity to do that in narrative. And here was Taylor offering me the opportunity to do that in a narrative TV space. And I love it. It sounds crazy on paper. It is only possible by virtue of the fact that I have a tremendous team that I've been working with for a very long time. My gaffer, my key grip, my camera operators are all absolute ninja artistic geniuses at what they do and understand my shorthand very well. So it takes a lot of the explanation out of the process for me, but also a lot of the decisions and conversations that you would have as a director with your cinematographer, I don't have to have out loud. And it doesn't make things any less stressful, but I really enjoy the interplay of exploring those two roles at the same time.
As a director, you're ultimately in charge of pretty much everything, right?
It's a lot of decisions. You make a lot of decisions in a day.
Yeah. So to have that team that you're so used to, that you just know each other, the shorthand.
Yes, I very much subscribe to the notion of a film crew, a film set being a family and taking care of each other like a family. My assistant director, Heather Abels, is an extension of my brain. She is the reason I show up anywhere on time and get anything done in a manner that doesn't get me fired. She's a genius at what she does. And I think filmmaking is such a collaborative enterprise that at its best, it is a bunch of people who are all very good at what they do, coming together to take care of each other and to take care of the project. And if you can trust that process and surround yourself with people who are exceptional at their jobs, the work is naturally going to be elevated. I believe there are two kinds of people in the world: people who choose to surround themselves by people who are better and smarter and more inspired than they are, and those who choose to surround themselves by people who are less so that they can shine. And I am very much a subscriber to the notion that I want to be the least shiny person in the room. I want to surround myself with people who are exceptional talents, because I think the work is elevated when you do that.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about Yellowstone. So there's this old joke, you don't work with kids or animals, and you've done both, but you've really leaned into the animals. So horses, cattle. What are the challenges of that cast?
There are a lot. I have a secret weapon, which is my husband, Jason Owen, is an animal coordinator and wrangler and stuntman. We met on a movie 16 years ago. He has been working in Taylor's universe for the last 5 years. So I have a magic decoder ring of all things livestock, horses. There are just certain hard and fast rules about what you can and can't do to keep people safe. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that most people would never imagine. When we did the tornado sequence in 1883, our wrangler team were rehearsing those wagon horses for probably about a month in front of these large turbine fans to desensitize them to the sound, to the impact of the air. There's so much that goes into making a good movie horse a good movie horse. And most of that you don't even see happening on set. It's happening for weeks and months outside of anyone's purview before those animals even get to set. But we've been very lucky in Taylor's universe to be working with some of the best people in the business and having that guidance from professionals who have been in this very unique niche lane of storytelling. You don't realize how ubiquitous animals are in films until you really start looking for it. Jason has, in the last year, we've worked with raccoons and snow leopards and elephants and a ferret that now lives in our house, not to mention the horses and donkeys and goats and all the traditional stuff, right? So you learn something different every time you work with a different animal.
So you just have to be open to work. We're going to be flexible. We're just going to, you can't block every scene. And
it's funny, when I did the first episode I directed on Yellowstone in season 3, there was a scene that Taylor wrote that was 200 mares and foals cascade down the mountain. And there was a producer on the show who said, well, you're going to storyboard that, right? I said, no, I'm not going to storyboard that. We're going to get 5 cameras and we're going to run 200 horses down a mountain. It's not like they're going to hit their mark or stop when you ask them to. They're horses. So you have to be understanding of what is and isn't possible. And that's something that I find new directors working in the Western space have to learn. On Dutton Ranch, which we've been shooting this year, we made sharebacks for Video Village for our wranglers that say cowboy police, because their job extends not only to showing directors how animals can work in scenes and what is appropriate in a roping or a rodeo, but also there are certain rules of etiquette that have always been, authenticity has always been so important to Taylor. And there are certain things that any cowboy in America will look at and go, that's wrong. His hat's on backwards. Why does he have spurs on when he's at the grocery store? Little things that the average person in New York would never notice, but the average cowboy in Texas would go, that's ridiculous. And so we've been relying on our animal team to help guide directors in authenticity and not just the animal work.
So there was such an intense interest in Yellowstone, especially at the end. How do you manage to keep that a secret?
The final season of Yellowstone was a feat of patience and diligence and camaraderie, I'd say. All of our scripts were heavily redacted. Only department heads had an opportunity to read them. They had to go to Taylor's office in Texas and be supervised while reading them and take notes. And it became my job to redact every script for every actor to only include scenes that they were involved in or had to have the knowledge of. It made it very, very difficult on every single department in terms of just sharing the information they needed to within their teams to get the show made. It made it difficult for actors who felt like they were only privy to certain elements of the story and really had no idea what else was going on in the show. But I think the fact that the secrets were kept is proof that it all worked out. And, we went to very great lengths to make sure, even in scenes that were very, very sensitive in terms of what the content We cast people from the crew to play certain roles, so you weren't exposing some actor who was only going to be on the show to one day to a big secret and burdening them with having to keep that to themselves for 6 months until the show came out. So it was a Herculean effort across many different platforms to keep that under wraps.
So it was 6 months.
I think we started shooting in May and it came out in November. So yeah.
Well done.
Thanks.
All right, let me get to another kind of scene that I've actually been dying to ask you about. You directed an iconic fight scene between Beth Dutton and Summer. I couldn't help but think back to Dynasty. There was an iconic fight scene between Joan Collins and Linda Evans. And this sort of, to me, is like a modern day of that. Tell us about blocking that scene, shooting that scene.
We are very, very lucky to work with the caliber of stunt coordinators that we do in Taylor's world, Jason Rodriguez and Jordan Warwick. And there's a tremendous amount of choreography that goes into the fights. There's what is written on the screen. The stunt coordinators will put together a previs of that. That will be adjusted. Then that will be rehearsed. I will say our cast on all these shows are all game to do as much actor action as possible. If someone's falling off a horse or falling out of a building, obviously you're not going to let them do that. But, on Yellowstone, all the actors do their own riding. When we do hand-to-hand combat stuff or fights like the one that you're talking about, the actresses want to be in it as much as possible. Taylor likes to write messy, fun, enormous fight scenes. There's a great one in the Madison this season, and that was all Bo Garrett and Elle Chapman did almost all the work themselves. So they're fun, and they take time. They take time to do safely. I think the more preparation that goes into them, the better they end up being. But the scrappier and messier a fight, the more time went into making it feel that way.
All right, so you mentioned the Madison. Let's talk about the Madison. It's not a direct spinoff of Yellowstone.
No.
So how would you describe it?
I think Madison is one of the most intimate stories that Taylor has told. It is a story about love and grief and family and the way in which tragedy can reinvent us and the way in which family brings out the best and worst in ourselves. And it's also a real meditation on the power of land to transform us. In a lot of Taylor's shows, the land, it becomes a character. And in Yellowstone, it is something that is fought for and fought after. In the Madison, it becomes a new frontier for this family who is not really familiar with what the natural world of the West is, coming from New York City, and how that changes them as individuals.
So the land really is a character.
Very much so.
So much of the beauty of it is the light. And as a director, do you just only see the light as a backdrop to everything? It's so extraordinary.
As a cinematographer, you are always thinking about the light. As a director, you are thinking about everything. There is a very intentional dance around scheduling and taking into consideration not just the light, but the length of the scene, the emotional temperature of the scene, and how much time you're going to want for that moment. And should we do it in the morning? Should we do it in the shade? You cannot recreate the kind of magic that happens at sunrise or sunset in nature. I don't care how good you are at your job, how many 18Ks you have, how many electricians on your crew. I think the most beautiful work in the natural world and cinematography comes from working with what the natural world is giving you. And we were able to do that a lot on the show. But it was a very precise dance of making sure we were always looking in the right direction, that we were scheduling our days in such a way that we wouldn't run out of light, starting with close-ups while this light was getting more and more beautiful. It was always kind of an organic recalibration to make sure we were in the right place at the right time, because the light is beautiful in that part of Montana all the time in the fall, but it's definitely more spectacular at certain points of the day. And we tried to shoot magic hour as much as we possibly could. We had 5 cameras on for most of the Montana work, which allowed us to move through scenes more quickly, so you could do more of it at the perfect light. But there is a lot of strategy involved in making that possible.
Okay, so the Madison stars Michelle Pfeiffer and Kurt Russell, Without giving too much away, there's a lot that Michelle's Stacy gets to do. What was your working relationship with her? Were you involved in casting?
No, Michelle was attached to the project when I became involved. I was very, very nervous the first time I met her. You know, she is a legend and an icon to me. She is one of the most caring, hardworking, precisely meticulous, masterful craftsman of an art form I've ever worked with in my life. She is very tough on herself, but she is also incredibly nurturing to the cast around her, and I think took her role as the matriarch in the Clyburn family as well as in our film family very seriously. She knew she was the person everyone was looking to sort of set the tone, and her focus and resilience and heart through the process of making the show was absolutely remarkable.
The major theme of the Madison, which was written by Taylor Sheridan, is the difference between people in New York City and Montana. So you spent time in both. How do you see the differences?
It's funny, when I got sent the script, I couldn't believe that I was getting an opportunity to direct it as a East Coast, Boston, New York raised artist who found herself falling in love with a cowboy and then moving to Texas, and now I make Westerns. I never saw that narrative happening for me. I've gotten a lot of questions about the humor, and there's a little bit of, snarkiness about sort of the East Coast elite attitudes. And it's funny because I have a very unique perspective because I was that person. I was the New Yorker who went to West Texas and couldn't believe there wasn't cell service or a grocery store nearby where you could get fish. The things you take for granted when you live in an urban environment that now seem so silly to me. But at the time, I realized I had all these preconceived notions about what living in rural America meant, what I would find, what I wouldn't find. I was humbled by my experience of moving out west and had to reckon with the fact that there was a whole lot that I thought that I knew that I didn't. And what I think is beautiful about the way those differences are portrayed in the Madison is, yes, there's humor, and yes, there's pointed commentary, but underneath that, I think it services the notion that we all have more in common than we have not. And I think at this time, in our world, it's a really marvelous thing to try to spend more time thinking about what we have in common as opposed to what our differences are, because there's so much attention placed on the things that we disagree about and the things that separate us as communities, when in reality, I think one of the undertones to Madison is really about how much we have in common. And the theme of grief throughout the show and resilience is something that is universal. And I think that underneath all of the things that on the surface make us feel like strangers to each other, we are more often than not very much the same.
So in the Madison, you directed all of the episodes. How did that feel?
Yeah, it's funny. People have asked me questions about specific episodes, and I can't really remember where one ends and the other begins, because it feels like making a 6-hour movie. It feels like telling a complete story. It's a beautiful experience to have. It is not for people who love sleep. It is not for the faint of heart in many ways. It was 4 months of nonstop every day. You don't really get a moment to catch your breath. And there's a lot to track, and especially the way that we shot that show. We did all the exteriors in Montana and the interiors on a stage in Texas. So someone would have a big emotional moment outside and walk into the cabin, and you'd be like, hold that, we'll come back to that 2 months from now in a different state on a stage. So there was a lot to track throughout the process, but the sense of fullness and wholeness that comes out of being able to tell a story like that beginning to end is really remarkable.
So were there directors that you learned from, that you were inspired by?
Yes. I mean, my first episodic directing credit was offered to me by Ava DuVernay on her show Queen Sugar. When she created Queen Sugar for the Oprah Network, she created an incubator intentionally to give women directors an opportunity to direct television who might not have otherwise been given an opportunity. There is this myth that you can't direct television until you've directed television. And so her goal was to sort of bust that myth wide open and give people the tools they needed to understand the system. And so if you look at some of the most prolific women directing in television right now, the Amanda Marsalises of the world, she just won an award for her work on The Pit, or Demaine Davis, who's now a showrunner, Kat Candler. They all came up through Ava's world on Queen Sugar. So Ava was a huge inspiration for me. As a cinematographer, I got to work with Taylor, who is a brilliant, funny, very smart storyteller who I adore. I came up out of film school shooting indie films for James Franco, who really pushed the boundaries in many ways of what a film could be. I shot a movie for Tim Blake Nelson that he directed but also acted in, and I've really enjoyed that relationship and the trust that comes from an actor who has one job to do on screen but is also directing the movie, and the trust that they place in you as a cinematographer to be their eyes when you're doing that.
So as you're sort of promoted and getting to try different things, did you ever have a thought where you feel like, oh, I'm not up for this?
I think as I've gotten older, I've learned to recognize the different flavors of fear. There is one that is good. There's one that's not so good. And I've started to be able to figure out the difference. I have been a little bit terrified every time I've started something new, whether that was camera operating on the first season of Yellowstone, whether that was creating a tornado for 1883. There are things that come across your desk and you go, I don't know if I can do this. And sometimes that's the name of an actor, and sometimes it's a stunt or some sort of massive event that you need to create on screen. I think a healthy amount of fear is a sign that you are doing something to stretch your own capacity as an artist. Then there's the kind of fear that's just like your hackles go up. It's like the wrong person sitting next to you on the subway, and you need to trust that as well. But it took me a long time to figure out the difference, and that often what I was feeling anxious about was based on my own fear of not being able to succeed at it. And, you know, you do enough crazy things and you get to look back on the last 7 years of my life and all the things that I thought were impossible the first time someone mentioned them to me that I am now an expert in. And the only way you become an expert in is figuring out a way through it. And whether that's sending 200 horses down a mountain or wagons across rivers or working with actors that you only dreamed of working with when you were a child, there is a certain confidence that comes from everything that you were afraid of being behind you.
All right, well, let's go back then, before you were a director. So you almost didn't have this career. I know you studied theater at Harvard. So can you tell us about how you got onto this path?
I very much wanted to be an actor. Theater was my first love. I graduated from college. I wanted to go to grad school for theater. I applied to a program at the American Repertory Theater in Cambridge, and it was all that I wanted to do in my life. And as I was in the process of applying to schools, a friend of mine suggested I apply to film school, and I thought it was absurd. I had no desire to be a director. I was not a technical person. I didn't know what a cinematographer was. And my friend said, yeah, but you love telling stories, and becoming a filmmaker is really about telling stories. So I looked up a couple of applications, and the NYU application specifically really appealed to me because it was fun. It was an opportunity to collate all of my random creative pursuits into one place. I never in a million years thought I would get in. And I got asked to come in for an interview. And when I went to that interview, I took the Funghua bus from Boston to New York, and I was so nervous, and I left that interview in tears. There was a member of the faculty who was particularly grueling in her sort of line of questioning, and I walked out of that office in tears going, I was foolish to go. Who do I think I am, thinking I'm never going to get into this school? And 2 weeks later, I got offered a scholarship. And so I had already been accepted to the theater program that I wanted to do, and I deferred for a year, and I thought, I'll try this for a year and I'll see what happens. And I just never went back.
All right. So now we fast forward. Is there a time that you felt like, okay, I'm established here and this really is a career and this is going to work out okay?
I think when you come up freelancing, there is this mentality that the phone might never ring again. And it doesn't matter how established you are. So I think there's a difference between thinking it's going to be smooth sailing from here on out and the moment where you feel like you can identify as the thing that you are working as. For me, when we did 1883, that was the first project I'd done where I felt, you know what, if I went back to bartending tomorrow, I feel like I have done something in this path. That was, to me, the first show where I had no regrets. I felt like it was a rare moment in time to be an artist, and so supremely grateful for the collaborators I got to work with on that project. So lucky that Taylor chose me for the episodes that he trusted me with. That's one kind of feeling of arrival. I don't know. You know, life is short and mercurial, and you never know what's going to happen next. I have very talented friends who haven't worked in 3 years because, you know, the industry is changing and there aren't as many opportunities in certain avenues as there used to be. I never take it for granted. I have a very hard time saying no to work because I never take it for granted that something else is right around the corner. You just don't know. So I think I've always felt like I was an artist. I think it's probably been about 10 years since I've realized I could make a living as one. And I couldn't tell you what's around the corner next. 5 years from now, maybe I'm running a dog sanctuary in Mexico. Who knows?
So do you ever think from where you started, from that New York woman to married to your husband, you live in Texas, animals around all the time, and involved in the Taylor Sheridan universe. Does that surprise you? Or do you feel like this is where I was always meant to be?
Both, I think. It's funny, I remember reading a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe when I was in college and thinking, who leaves New York and moves out to the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert, at that point in your life? And I was thinking about that recently. If somebody had told me when I was 25 and convinced I would never leave New York City, that I live in a dusty little town in West Texas and I make Westerns now, I couldn't have tracked that trajectory. It makes perfect sense to me in a lot of ways. You know, my parents were both Hungarian immigrants. My dad learned how to speak English by watching Westerns on television. He was a huge John Ford aficionado. He had a Stetson that it would drive my mother crazy that he'd wear to the grocery store on the Upper East Side. She'd be like, why are you wearing a cowboy hat in Manhattan? You're not even a cowboy. So there are things that feel like they all add up when I look at it backwards that never would have made sense looking at it forwards. I mean, meeting my husband is the perfect example. You know, we met on a movie where there was a lot of wagon and mule work, and we could not stand each other when we first met. And I thought he was a mansplainy, red state macho guy, and he thought I was a very precious hipster from Brooklyn with a very liberal agenda, and we were both a little bit right. And, you know, we've been together for 15 years. We would not have checked any of the same boxes on a dating app. And if you had told me 15 years ago that I would have ended up moving to Texas, I wouldn't have believed it. And I wouldn't have believed that I am now a fairly decent expert at shooting horse stunts and rodeos and Westerns. They don't teach you how to shoot Westerns as a class in film school because there aren't a lot of people who get to do it. And I feel very, very lucky that I get to do it.
That almost sounds like a movie in itself, right?
Yeah. It's a great meet cute. Yeah.
Okay, so what's the plan for season 2 for the Madison?
We've already shot it.
Already shot it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We finished it just before Christmas.
And can you tell us anything?
No.
Okay. So let's talk about what's next for you. You're staying in the Taylor Sheridan universe with the Tulsa King spinoff, Frisco King, with Samuel Jackson, and the Dutton Ranch. So what can you tell us about those?
We are wrapping up on Dutton Ranch. I go back to Texas today to film a couple days this week, and then we start shooting Frisco King very soon, shooting in New Orleans and Atlanta and Texas for the pilot, and then the show will take place primarily in Texas.
Next up is our lightning round. More with Christina after this. Okay, Christina, time for our lightning round. All right, we have some fun questions for you. A few would you rather, some other questions. All I ask is that you just answer the first thing that pops into your head. Don't give it too much thought. Would you rather fencing or horseback riding?
Horseback riding.
Sneakers or cowboy boots?
Cowboy boots.
Okay. favorite cocktail to make?
Aperol Spritz.
Really? Okay. Do you have a hidden talent?
I'm a pretty good cook.
Would you rather hang out with cats, dogs, or goats?
Goats.
I don't get that answer a lot.
I've had a lot of goats. Baby goats are probably the cutest animal on the planet, and then they grow up and they're not so cute. But when they're little, they're pretty darn cute.
Okay. What is the best thing about living in Texas?
The space.
What was your favorite TV show growing up?
Alf.
Alf. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. What is your must-have item on set?
My dog.
Would you rather direct a fly fishing scene or a Kurt Russell, Michelle Pfeiffer bathtub scene?
A Kurt Russell, Michelle Pfeiffer bathtub scene.
Okay. Would you rather go to a Celtics game or a rodeo?
Ooh, that's hard. Probably a Celtics game just because I've been to a lot of rodeos recently and I'm a Boston girl and the Celtics are, that love goes deep.
Okay. What did you do with the first big amount of money you made?
That's a really good question. I think I put down a deposit on my apartment in Brooklyn.
Okay. What's something you've changed your mind about in the last year?
Whether or not to take time off.
Sounded like you ended up with no.
No.
Okay. What is your favorite Western made before 2010?
City Slickers.
City Slickers. Okay, that's fantastic. If you weren't making TV shows or movies, what else would you be doing?
I'd be running a restaurant or a dog sanctuary.
Okay. What is the best advice you've been given?
Not to take no for an answer.
Who gave you that?
I've heard it from a lot of people who felt they hadn't taken that own advice themselves and regretted it.
Okay, the last one, 2 parts. What's the best investment you've ever made and the worst investment you've ever made? And it's a very broad definition of investment. It could be a class. It could be anything.
Best investment was a mini DV camcorder my first year of film school because I was too afraid to show how little I knew about cinematography in my camera classes in film school, and I wanted to learn it on my own, and I did a documentary that changed my life. Worst investment, I have more boots than I'll ever wear.
Okay, can we tell us about the documentary?
It was a documentary called The Ladies. It was about my 2 Hungarian great aunts whose couch I was sleeping on while I was going to film school. It's a very kind of Grey Gardens, Eastern Bloc love story to these 2 older women who had been costume designers. And it's funny walking down to the studio. One of my favorite memories as a kid is once I got old enough to run around New York on my own, my aunts would send me down to the garment district with a list of zippers or colors of silk for linings of dresses, and I would come do my rounds in this neighborhood and pick things up for them for their couture shop.
Oh, that's good. Thank you so much for spending the time here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for taking time to listen to our conversation on How She Does It. Wishing you all a week filled with adventure and beautiful views. We'll have another great conversation for you soon. Until then, onward.